listening to PlaceDive, the podcast that does a deep dive into urban public spaces you've probably never thought twice about. I'm talking about places like street corners, underpasses, parking lots, and alleyways. And that last one, alleyways, are exactly what we're going to talk about today. So what do you think of when you hear the word alleyway? If you watch much TV, and especially shows like Gotham, Boardwalk Empire, or Law & Order SVU, it's probably the Cortlandt Alley. That one alleyway that shows up in pretty much every crime drama. Or if you're a millennial or the parent of one, you might have a sunnier vision. Maybe you think of Diagon Alley, that place that all the wizards and witches go to get their wands, owls, and toads in the Harry Potter series. But whether we see alleyways as dark or magical or something in between, the way that city governments are seeing them is as valuable urban space. More and more, in places like Detroit, Melbourne, Vancouver, and Seattle, cities are turning their alleyways into open-air markets, spas, restaurant patios, and cafes. But at PlaceDive, we want to take a different approach. Instead of asking what alleyways can become, we want to know what they are already. What are the hidden stories we don't know about? What do the history books not say? And what is an alleyway's value to the people that walk through it every day? Or those who walked through it 200 years ago? In order to start answering these questions, today we're taking a look at the Bishop and Mackay alleyway in downtown Montreal. It's sandwiched between Concordia University and St. Jack's the Apostle Anglican Church, and surrounded by lots of pubs and cafes. So before this alleyway was an alleyway, it was just land. Mohawk land, to be exact. As it still is today, by the way. Now, we don't know exactly what the Mohawks of that time were doing in this spot, but we can imagine. We know that they were skilled farmers of maize and other crops, and there were tons of native plant species in the area. If you were standing there at the time, you would have seen elm trees, ash trees, and maples, wild strawberries, blackcurrants, and sweet hackberry. Whatever the people were doing there at that time, it all started to change in the 1500s, with the arrival of Jacques Cartier and the French, and then the English. So much so that by the 1800s, this vast expanse of land our alleyway lies upon was owned by one single person, an Englishman named Thomas Phillips. Phillips didn't live on this land. Instead, he rented it out to farmers, and we know that in the early 1800s, they were growing barley, wheat, and corn, and they had a couple cows, pigs, and sheep. At that time, the alleyway would have been a passageway between plots of land, a way that farmers avoided trampling over their crops. And it probably would have smelt a lot like manure. By the mid-1850s, Phillips had tired of the farm life. He decided instead to rent his lands out to two local sports teams, the lacrosse club and the cricket club. The finest young men in Montreal would play here, or the finest young British men, I should say. They played for many years with a brief pause in 1861, because that's the year the American Civil War threatened to cross over into Canadian territory. Immediately, the men assembled and switched out their sticks and clubs for bayonets and their running for marching to create the Victoria Rifle Regiment, which never ended up fighting any Americans. In 1864, our alleyway got its first wall, which was to the south. That's the year the St. James the Apostle Anglican Church was built. They used to call it St. Crickets of the Fields because the cricket players played around there, but also because they broke the stained glass windows a couple times. By accident, of course. The church was originally built to get people to come live in the area, but that didn't really work. So 20 years later, Thomas Phillips had another idea. He was going to sell the land around the church for development. You see, at that time, the first Montreal City Planning Committee was being created, and on it were names like Redpath and McGill. You might have heard of those. Basically, they were very wealthy British men. They wanted to create a mini Edinburgh or London in the area. They wanted it to be full of terraced homes and wealthy people. Well, those terraced homes, meaning homes with terraces, did go up. And one of the most important ones for us is at 1426 Bishop Street, right at the northeastern end of our alleyway. This house was called the London House after Robert London, a prominent doctor in the area. But we are a lot more interested in who he was married to. His wife was Octavia Grace Ritchie, one of the most important feminist figures in Quebec's history. She was a suffragette and a women's activist, but also the first woman in Quebec to graduate from medical school. Ritchie's private medical practice was in that very house. So you have to wonder what other women's rights activists or suffragettes might have gone through our alleyway on their way to Ritchie's place. Well, 100 years later, many of the other houses around hers would be demolished, and so would many apartment buildings. That's because in the 1990s, the Sir George Williams campus of Concordia University was built. And coincidentally, our alleyway got its northern wall. I think this is a good spot to change our focus away from the archives and history books and to take a look at the living history of the alleyway, meaning the type of history that lives in the people who use it every day. In the middle of the alleyway, there's a big old tree. And if you're there late at night, you might hear some rustling in the leaves and branches. And if you were to look up, you'd see a cloud of little white things floating down towards you. No, not snow, though we are in Montreal. They're sesame seeds, breadcrumbs, because this is where Clive the raccoon hangs out. Or at least this is what Marina told me. Marina spent pretty much her whole undergrad at McGibbon's Irish Pub next door. Their terrace looks on the alleyway itself. Marina used to get really, really drunk with all her cool professors and best friends from her program. And they usually hung out on the terrace itself. They'd get drunker and drunker drinking their beer and eating their nachos and telling their stories, and the drunker they got, the more generous they got. So they'd take the hamburger buns off their hamburgers and dip their yam fries in chipotle mayo and throw them up to Clive the raccoon to eat. Everybody knew Clive, though nobody remembers who named him. Anyways, Marina would have given him something a lot more dignified. You know, something like Mr. Pickles. Now, I want you to take a 90-degree turn to your right. In your head, of course. Don't hit anything. Imagine you're walking towards Mackay Street. Well, in a couple seconds, you're going to come across another big old tree in a little parking lot to your left. See, that tree is the spot that somebody lived in for many, many months. There used to be a shopping cart turned on its side with a piece of plywood covering the entrance and the name Serrano scribbled on the front. I used to see tons of empty Pringles tubes and the occasional empty beer can, condom wrapper, or cigarette carton over there too. But this is where somebody lived. Somebody found a sense of privacy, maybe even a bit of safety there that they wouldn't find on the front side of the space where everybody else is. I think like Clive the raccoon, alleyways can create a sense of belonging where you can't find one anywhere else. Alleys are the great equalizer because here it doesn't really matter if you're rich or poor because everybody's just hanging out. And now if you turn back into the alley and kept on walking towards Mackay, you'd walk right over the spot that Nancy saw her first rat. That's right, Her first dirty, gray, furry little creature. Or at least she's pretty sure it was the first time. Yeah, it was the first time. It was lying there on its side, then getting up, walking around in circles, and was pretty clearly dazed. All the undergrads hanging around smoking were yelling at it, and that pissed Nancy off a lot. So as she turned the corner and saw it, she immediately started yelling back at everybody and got ready to protect the rat. It was not the first time that Nancy had to protect something. She'd protected many a pigeon and many a person in her life. She immediately asked the guy smoking on the restaurant stoop, go get her a box, and he did. So when he came back, she got the rat in the box and started making her way back to that tree where the homeless person used to live. But then somebody stopped her. It was a young guy, maybe 19 or 20, and he said, "Please, take my sub." And he shoved a Subway sandwich right in her face. "It's for the rat," he said. "Maybe he's hungry." So she thanked them and put the sub in the box with the rat and went over to the tree. She laid it against the tree gently so that if it was going to die, at least it would have a nice death. And if it was just hungry, at least it had a sub to eat. She walked away without realizing that this was not only the first time she saw a rat. In the beginning of that journey, it was the beginning of her journey with death. So this is the part of the podcast when we take a little detour. Because while Nancy's story starts in the alleyway, it really takes off in Toronto. A few months after this whole rat incident, Nancy took a plane and moved to Toronto. And not too long after she moved into this shared flat in one of those old Toronto houses, so did the mice and rats. Yeah. They were pretty much everywhere. In her floorboards when she was trying to sleep at night, in her walls scratching at her as she was studying, on the shelf staring at her, making eye contact as she was trying to watch TV. And Nancy was gently going insane. So she tried to kill them. With glue traps, regular traps, humane traps, nothing worked. And it was around this time that the deaths started. Inconspicuous at first, just a little baby raccoon lying flat as a pizza on her street. Somebody had squished it, I guess, and animal control wouldn't come pick it up, so the neighbors just laid flowers on it and made a little memorial. It was sad, but nothing to be freaked out about, right? Well, not too long after that was the murder. Yeah, I said murder. Somebody killed someone on her block, and do you know where they found the murderer? In the house across from hers. Yeah. So that's when Nancy started to get a little bit nervous. And that is when the tough stuff really started. First, it was her aunt. Nancy was with her when she died, and for months afterwards, she couldn't shake this creepy crawly feeling like death had just attached itself to her and was hanging around like a cloud. And then a couple months later, her cousin on the same side of the family had an overdose and died. She wasn't even a drug addict. She was just this 19-year-old girl taking ecstasy at a party. Yeah, it was really, really sad. And Nancy couldn't take it. The doctor said she probably had some kind of PTSD from the stress of it all. So when she came home one day and her roommate said the landlord was moving back and they were going to have to leave, Nancy pretended to be sad, but inside she was screaming for joy. And of course, relief. Nancy started doing research in Los Angeles. She was there pretty often. And sometimes she would take her boyfriend along so she didn't get bored. Because, you can't do interviews all day. So they'd go explore the city and go watch movies at night. Often they were kind of crappy little Hollywood rom-coms. But you got a couple laughs. So one night when they were walking back to the Airbnb, they were reciting these stupid little lines back to each other when all of a sudden they heard this movement in the bushes. "Oh, those are rats," her boyfriend said. And they were. 2 juicy-looking Los Angeles rats. "Oh, they're so gross," he said. "Yeah, but they're kind of cute, though," Nancy replied. See, she hadn't really told him about the connection she'd made. I mean, she told him about the deaths, but not really the rodents. She didn't really tell people that because they would probably think she's crazy. So she just kept it to herself. She kept her mouth shut. But then, in the morning, of course, they didn't wake up to the alarm clock. They woke up to a call from his mom. His grandma had died. And that is when Nancy knew. She wasn't just making it up. It wasn't just a coincidence, this whole rats and death thing. No, it was real. Every time she saw a rat, somebody died. Over the years, it kept happening. Parents, friends, parents. Every time she saw a rat, somebody died. And back in Montreal, right, Nancy had moved back to Montreal by this time. Sorry, I forgot to tell you. Her cat was getting really old. She was 16 at the time. And Nancy knew she was coming to her end. And she just wanted it to be beautiful. Not like her aunt's death or her cousin's death. She just wanted peace. And one night, she had a dream. The cat was out on the deck, and Nancy was inside behind a screen door, trying to get to it, but she couldn't. There was this big, fat, 3-meter-tall rat standing in her way. And Nancy just got so mad. She summoned all the strength she could. That superhero dream strength. She powered herself up and pushed the rat out of the way. She scooped up her cat and ran back inside. And in waking life, her cat did die, and it was beautiful. And at that moment, Nancy remembered the rat she'd so desperately tried to save in Bishop and Mackay. And she realized the reason that she tried so desperately to save it. Because everything, good news, bad news, death, ugly sewer rats, everything deserves respect. If you walk out of the parking lot and take a right turn, you'll start going towards Bishop Street. And as you do, you'll walk over a sewage drain that all the snow drains down in the winter because nobody really cleans this place up. And then as you keep walking, you'll come across a staircase. This is a staircase to the back door of the church. And for a long time, there was a big, dark, open space underneath it. The kind of space that nobody would see you in, day or night. It's perfectly hidden from the university, from the pub, from the restaurant. And it's the kind of place you could do a lot of things in secret. And that is exactly what Robbie was thinking when he... Well, before I get into that, maybe I should take you back. Yeah. Let's take another detour, but this time, let's go to NDG. Because that is where Robbie was a juvenile delinquent. It started with stealing. You know, just little stuff. Robbie and his buddies would crack open the back doors of shops and take whatever they wanted. But the thing is, you can't just run out onto Sherbrooke Street at 3 a.m. The cops are going to get you. And all the cops knew Robbie. The second they saw him, they'd say, "Hey kid, get in the car. We know you did something. We're just going to drive around until we figure out what that is." So Robbie had to figure out a different way of getting around. And that's when he discovered this whole alleyway network that goes all along the length of Sherbrooke Street. So him and his friends would get their loot and then run home through the alleyways. And the alleys didn't just serve as a means of transport. That's where they hung out. Robbie and his friends would smoke joints there and talk shit. And there's this one guy named Alan. See, pot was a pretty big deal back then. It was a serious offense. And Alan, he sold it. He was always running somewhere. Running to restock, running to deliver, running to smoke a joint himself. He was this icon of the alleyway. And Robbie and his friends, at one point, they made a band, as, you know, teenagers tend to do. And one of the first songs was There Goes Alan. Yeah. It was this whole different world. And it's there that Robbie really solidified his identity as a criminal. But he wouldn't be there long. Pretty soon, he moved downtown to other alleyways. Because that's where he started selling drugs. At that time, the big thing was Coke. You'd have a couple beers, have a couple lines of Coke. No big deal. And that's what Robbie was selling. But he wasn't about to be caught with drugs on him. He'd been to jail already. So he had a guy selling in every single bar on Bishop Street and most of the bars on Mackay. And he would just hang out in another bar and wait to be called. And when he got that call that one of his guys needed to be restocked, he'd make his way through the alleyway to the arcade on St. Catherine Street. And at that time, downstairs, there was a peep show. And if you don't know what a peep show is, you should probably Google it. But it's a pretty gross place. There's a curtain and a little TV and a vinyl seat where you do what you do. So Robbie would go down there and he'd reach his hand into that nasty vinyl seat and pull out his drugs. See, nobody else really wanted to put their hands in there. And if somebody was watching, they would have thought he was just the most chronic masturbator ever. Like, man, this guy is going in there 5-6 times a day. What's wrong with him? But that was Robbie's secret, his trade secret. And if he thought that somebody was going to rip him off or that the cops were after him, a peep show was a pretty good place to go. And if he thought they were going to follow him there, he'd run out into the alleyway that had a back door onto it. Because if somebody is following you into an alleyway, you know they're following you. It's clear as day. All this hanging around in alleyways and in bars would end up changing Robbie's life. Because one night, he met a guy named Nick Oftermar. Nick was a city councilman and a really popular guy in the neighborhood. Nick liked Robbie. He thought he was super duper smart and he knew that Robbie wanted to write. So he hooked him up with his first little newspaper gig. And that was it. That was the start of Robbie's writing career. He would end up writing for major Canadian publications, writing plays, creating songs for Cirque du Soleil, and even co-founding a little magazine called Vice. Pretty soon, all this alleyway action would take Robbie in yet another direction. He'd start his undergrad in philosophy at Concordia University, just one street over. Robbie was a really good student. He was getting all A+ and A's. He went to every tutorial, even the ones he didn't need to be going to, because they were for people who were struggling, and he was not struggling, especially in his logic class. He'd go to the extra tutorials and just mess around with his friends. They'd joke and give the teacher's assistant a hard time. The TA would be saying something like, okay, so logically, steak is not a plant. And then Robbie would interrupt him and say, yeah, but what about a steak plant? So naturally, this kind of pissed the guy off. After a couple weeks of this, he finally snapped. Robbie made his typical little joke and the teacher's assistant screamed back at him. Okay, well then, why even study philosophy at all? Everybody else in the class looked shocked. They were 20-year-old kids after all. So Robbie shut his mouth and decided not to make a big deal of it right now. When the end of class came, the teacher's assistant left really quickly, but Robbie caught up to him downstairs. He was smoking a cigarette, and Robbie thought, okay, I'm gonna make this right. Hey, man, he yelled at him. Hey, I'm really sorry, man. I know I can be pretty annoying, and, I was just trying to have a good time, just, laugh it off. But, I know people are struggling. I should be more sensitive to that, But, yeah, man, but it was really cool, you yelled at me in front of everybody. That I didn't like that. The TA just stared at him. Yeah, okay, thanks. Robbie was trying to get an apology out of him, too, but he wasn't budging. Robbie didn't mind saying sorry. He knew he fucked up sometimes. But if you didn't accept that apology properly and take ownership for what you did, well, now we're gonna go. The TA snuffed out his cigarette on the concrete and turned to walk away. But Robbie was not gonna let him get away with this. Hey, man. Yeah, do you understand what I'm saying, man? Like, it wasn't really cool what you did, And yeah, I know. I'm pretty annoying guy sometimes. I know, man. But don't you think maybe you shouldn't have done that either? They crossed the street on Maisonneuve and started walking down Mackay. As they continued, Robbie became more and more adamant. Come on, man. Like, you got to see it the way I see it, man. It wasn't cool what you did. But the TA wasn't giving him anything. And it was driving Robbie crazy. He used to be driving in traffic and somebody would give him the finger and he'd just go ballistic knowing he wasn't going to be able to catch up to that guy. He was trying to make different choices. But as they approached the alley, the TA suddenly said, "All right, man, see you later," and took a sharp left turn in. I guess he thought Robbie wasn't going to follow him, because he looked surprised when Robbie turned too. And it was at that moment that they both knew they weren't in the classroom anymore. They weren't really on campus. Now, they were on Robbie's turf. A lot of people were aware of Robbie's background. The robbery, the drug selling, the jail time. I mean, just looking at him, you knew that he was tough. So it was pretty likely that the TA did too. And based on the way his steps started to quicken when they walked into the alley, and the way his movements got jerkier, and how he just responded, yep, yep, to everything Robbie said, he probably knew too. It was amazing how this guy that had just screamed him in the classroom all of a sudden was terrified. He was terrified of Robbie. Who knows how many confrontations the TA had ever been in, how many fights, how many times had he even walked through an alleyway. Meanwhile, Robbie's whole life unraveled in them. But things were also changing. I guess those 2 minutes that they walked across the alley was enough, because by the time they got to the end, back on the front side on Bishop Street, the TA turned to him and said, "Hey, man, yeah, okay, I shouldn't have yelled at you." And they shook hands. The TA left towards St. Catherine, and Robbie walked back through the alley. As he did, he passed by those back steps I told you about earlier, the ones coming out of the church that are hidden. Man, Robbie thought, if I wanted to kick his ass, I would have done it right there. So what comes to mind now when you hear the word alleyway? Hopefully it's more than magic wands and law and order. Because today we found out that an alleyway can have its own hidden history that nobody knows about. It can be a place where animals and people find belonging, and it can change the trajectory of people's lives for years to come. The Bishop Mackay alleyway is not a special place. it's like any other alleyway, full of secret stories waiting to be discovered. So next time, if you're in the neighborhood, come take a peek between Bishop and Mackay streets. If you're lucky, you might even be able to say hi to Clive, the raccoon. If you liked our episode today on Montreal alleyways, please consider donating to the St. James Drop-In Centre. This organization has been operating since 1985, and for most of those years, it was set up right in our alleyway. It helps people get access to hot showers, employment, counseling, and even arts programs. To make a donation, please go to stjamescentre.ca. And if you have a public space that you love or a story that you want to tell, you can go to PlaceDive.com and tell us all about it.